Hey, I have something shocking for you. I think stories, they're pretty cool. Mind-boggling, I know, but stories and art in general can do a very good job of showing us the social context of current society, and as such, it collides with many other parts of our social life, most notably with technology. Ever since we started depicting things with art in some metric, every time a new advancement in technology happened, stories and art changed to utilize it in an interesting way. We started by depicting the hunt via a 2D image on the wall, and then turning that 3D with sculpting. Our oral traditions were written down into dramatic epics before we invented the theater to depict these events and communicate ideas more visually. And then, of course, in the 20th century, we invented the screen to allow these stories to depict these events with greater realism. Stories are always evolving to fit in their current context, and generally, as technology improves in the space of storytelling, the general trend is that it adds greater realism and enhances immersion in a story. But if we continue that trend, moving forward with newer technologies, it only makes sense that the next logical step is through gaming. After all, what could be more immersive than actually participating in the story being told? And yet, I don't know about you, but while I like a lot of video game stories, so many of them feel lackluster, especially from the big players. COD, Halo, Star Wars, these are all franchises that tell stories in the medium of video games, but even when these stories are well written, they just feel so much less interesting than their counterparts in places like film, TV, prose, etc. So what's the deal? Well, broadly it comes down to the issue of strengths and weaknesses of the medium. Every medium has at least one thing it can do better than the others and one thing it struggles with. For instance, film has the advantage of complete visual clarity. There's no ambiguity in what things look like, and this allows filmmakers to establish settings and vistas in a single shot in a way you couldn't do in prose, no matter how many words you use to try and describe it. And likewise, a single look can convey a lot about a character's actions in a few seconds. A quick close-up shot of a character looking apprehensive before a major decision can communicate a lot about the character's mental state. This allows film to have greater subtlety than prose, as it can suggest things visually that the audience can interpret. In contrast, prose is startlingly good at conveying that exact kind of character development. The power of the written word allows it to communicate so much more about a character's thoughts and feelings than you can in film. As such, character-driven stories thrive in this medium, whilst film, especially popular film, is a lot more plot-driven, and the theater is the dominion of theme-driven stories, as the ambiguity of the stage and tangibility of the actors makes the fourth wall more malleable, allowing things like monologues and musical numbers to very effectively communicate a message in a way you just couldn't get in prose or film. I mean, seriously, try reading Shakespeare. It's not fun, but performing Shakespeare or listening to it makes everything more clear. So what is a video game's biggest strength and biggest weakness? Well, the strength is that immersion factor. By virtue of the fact that the audience is an active participant in the story, it allows them to get immersed into the world, foreshadowing for later in this video. As such, this allows writers to include many different storytelling techniques they couldn't do in other mediums, such as BioWare games like KOTOR and Mass Effect, which have branching narratives with different dialogue options that change the story. It's a character-driven story, but the player is one of the characters. Ironically though, the strength of the medium leads to its biggest weakness, story pacing. See, in most mediums, the pace of the story is set by the writer. Basically, imagine the writer pulling you by the hand at a certain speed, and that speed is the pace of the story. Good pacing in this context is when the speed the writer is pulling you at feels natural and relatively consistent, typically getting faster the further they go along. Bad pacing occurs when the writer jerks the audience around and/or makes the story feel relentless. However, because in a game the audience is participating in the story, this paradigm is thrown completely out the window because the player can decide to progress the story at any speed they see fit. This creates a problem when trying to tell more linear stories because in the event the player either breezes through the game or gets stuck, there's bound to be a disconnect between them and the story for the same reason bad pacing would. If the game moves too fast and suddenly stops to worry about the story, or if the story frames the actions of the characters in a certain light but the player didn't really do those actions, it can knock the player out of their suspension of disbelief. There are ways to counterbalance that and still preserve a linear cinematic story, however. For instance, God of War 2018 managed to do this expertly. The game teaches you early on to rely on Atreus as an essential part of the gameplay. Later, after learning he's a god, Atreus starts acting out, so in gameplay, Atreus stops obeying your one-button commands. This is very annoying and got me killed on occasion, so later when Kratos chews up Atreus for acting out and being a little asshole, we're right there with them because in gameplay he got us killed at least once. The story doesn't lose its impact because we struggled, instead the story actually acknowledges the reason why we struggled. Most AAA games don't do this, however. The most you'll usually get is lines of dialogue during gameplay that you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. And even then, they're not essential really, and they're very easy to tune out for most players. However, especially recently, there's been a growing number of games that don't just try to solve the pacing issue, but embrace it by playing with conventional story structure, using the shift in pacing instead of succumbing to it. For instance, Destiny 2 somehow manages to be innovative in such a way. Maybe the story is clunky, lore-rich, and confusing at times, yes, but the idea of setting the story as a backdrop to a live service is something Destiny invented and then continued to be the best at. Sorry, Apex. Because the story continues week to week as the game gets older, it creates a sense of community solidarity in the events of the story. Merging multiplayer into the story story to make the world feel real and keep you invested in saving it, with real gameplay changes that fundamentally alter the way the rest of the multiplayer is played. The story of Destiny 2 is really balmy and complicated, but this kind of solidarity encourages the fanbase to weather those elements in order to engage with the community Bungie has built here. But let's stop talking about a game that took half a decade to become good. We can do better than that, right? Can we? Let's see. Oh! Hades is a roguelite about the son of the titular god. Its art style is stylish and unique, the voice acting is exceptional, and it's really fun to beat up the undead with a shield. There's just one problem, it's a roguelite. And under that system, every time you die, you go back to the beginning. This feels like it'd be rife with pacing issues, as it'd be very hard to progress the story in any meaningful way if you have to go through the entire game again and again. But it doesn't, because the developers came up with a solution that removes any and all of these pacing issues. Instead of just starting at the beginning of the story again whenever you die, your death in-game is integrated into the plot, so whenever you die, no matter how far you got, when you reach the starting hub area, the characters have different dialogue with you. And even some of the bosses you killed in your last run are there, sulking about how you super humiliated them. And each time you return to the House of Hades, they have different lines of dialogue, so no matter how many times you die, it never feels like you aren't progressing, because at least you're progressing the story. And it's a well-written story to boot. The characters are interesting, either compelling or likable, and they all have different takes on Zagreus' decision to peace out from the underworld. It's such an interesting mechanic that makes the seemingly repetitive trek through the underworld again and again worth it, because it all loops back around to the main story of Zagreus wanting to escape it. It's awesome. If you haven't tried it, you totally should. It's one of my favorites, but it's not my absolute favorite, and yes, I'm gonna talk about it. You all know what character-driven storytelling is, right? It's basically a story where the characters drive the plot rather than the plot driving the characters, or theme-driven stories where everything is guided by the theme, even if it plays fast and loose with motivation and logic. Well, there is another aspect of storytelling that doesn't usually drive the story: the world. See, it's impossible to tell a world-driven story. A story where the main event is the world itself and actively propels it forward is just something that no story would ever really have the time for. Even in a 1,000-episode-long TV show, you're still confined by the laws of story structure. There's no way to explore an entire world without it feeling like a gimmick or too expository, which is where we bring in my final example for this thesis: Elden Ring. And also potentially the entire Soul series, though I haven't played them all yet. Everyone knows Elden Ring's story is vague, it's infamous at this point, but I bet a lot of you don't know why it's vague and why it works regardless of it still being engaging and well written, because Elden Ring doesn't have much in the way of plot. You defeat a few bosses with incredibly vague and ethereal cutscenes, and not much is explained to you outright. But ironically enough, the story is more interesting because it doesn't. Most of the interesting things about Elden Ring's story are found in contextual clues. The other quest lines, the lore of Radahn and Melania, are hidden in the world itself, and the player has to find them. This pretty much circumvents the pacing issue by removing linearity from the story completely. The story is the world, and whatever pace the player chooses to explore it in is the pace of the story. Dying doesn't take you out of the story because you have to find the story, instead of it just being out of reach. And because its story is hidden, Elden Ring can impact you in very strange ways. I cried at one point while going through Farum Azula, but not because of any characters or emotional gun punch moments, but because learning the true nature of this world and how just utterly tragic its decline made it sad that I would systematically destroy it with the frenzied flame ending. I got invested in the world because I made the effort to find out what it was all about. That's the point of an open world, isn't it, right? It's not a big open field littered with objectives, it's a world with a history and people in it, with wants and needs and all that stuff. There's no plot, just the world. And that is such a cool and unique way of telling a story and communicating an idea, and it is so much better than just putting all this work into a world only to litter it with samey side quests and one linear plot. These examples show you how you can tell an interesting and engaging story through the video game medium in ways that other mediums just can't. But instead, AAA companies seem to think that cinematic is the thing most gamers want. And judging by the popularity of basic movie simulators like The Last of Us, they might be right. But I am so tired of just getting these same stories every year. I want to see innovation, I want to see originality, and more importantly, I want to play a game, not watch a film and then fuck around in an arena for 20 minutes. Not read a novel or comic or just pick where the movie goes. There's so much interesting potential with this medium if devs would just stop baiting the cinematic every time a boss room is clear. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.